Far east, on January 17, 1960, bay near Iturup Island. There was a self-propelled barge at the very time when there were 4 soldiers on board. Among them were Junior Sergeant Askhat Ziganshin and 3 privates, Filip Poplavsky, Anatoly Kryuchkovsky, and Ivan Fedotov. The eldest of them was at most 21 years old. On Iturup Island, barges were used for commercial purposes, mainly for unloading ships that were unable to approach the shore due to the shallow water and rocky bottom. The crew practically lived on this barge and left it only occasionally, for example, to take turns going to the bathhouse or the Red Corner. The eldest was Ziganshin, who, after being drafted into the army, had undergone 8 months of training to pilot small boats. In December 1959, all 6 of the island's self-propelled barges were pulled ashore to wait out the winter's period of severe storms. The emergency food supply on board the ships, calculated to last for 10 days, was unloaded onto the shore. However, the plan was not destined to come true. Ironically, orders soon came to prepare for the unloadings of the last, somewhat delayed vessel, and 2 barges were launched shortly before January 17th. Both received 1.5 tons of diesel fuel and only 3 days' supply of drinking water and food. The T-36 barge was moored to a barrel 200 meters from the shore, and the T-97, in turn, was moored to it. After midnight on January 17th, a storm began, only intensifying as the morning progressed. Of course, the crew hoped it would soon subside, but back then, they couldn't even imagine what would happen next. A powerful hurricane, reaching speeds of 65 meters per second, tossed the barges around like toys. Unable to withstand the onslaught of the elements, the cable connecting the barges to the barrel snapped. To avoid colliding with each other, the crews were forced to uncouple the barges. Radio contact with the shore was maintained every 10 to 15 minutes. A message about the mooring failure was also transmitted to the shore. I started both of the barge's engines to move away from the shore and avoid smashing into the coastal rocks. However, poor visibility and strong winds prevented me from dropping anchor farther from shore. So I simply stopped the engines. When the barge began drifting toward the shore again 50 minutes later, the engines were restarted. The fight against the elements lasted more than 10 hours. At one point, the radio was violently shaken several times, causing it to malfunction. The coastline was very poorly visible, and heavy snow alternated with rain. The crew's only option was to wait for the storm to subside. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and the barge began drifting out to sea. Ziganshin considered it necessary to beach himself, but on his first attempt, the barge collided with a rock and sustained a hole, causing water to flood the engine room. During the next attempt, at about 10 p.m., when the barge was already touching the ground with its bottom, the fuel ran out and the engines simply stalled. In addition, the water that entered the cockpit flooded the radio station and all the instruments, making it impossible to repair them later. A task force was urgently formed to lead the search. A group of 15 soldiers was dispatched to survey the shore, and even despite stormy weather, a border patrol ship launched to sea to conduct the search. Later, as weather conditions improved, even aircraft were used to search the ocean. But all this activity ended very quickly after the soldiers discovered debris on the shore, namely, a life preserver from a barge and a broken coal box with the hull number T-36. All this gave reason to believe that the barge sank during a storm and the crew perished. Just a few days after the barge's disappearance, notices were sent to the families about their sons who were missing in action. With each passing day, the barge drifted further and further into the open, boundless ocean. While the soldiers initially hoped they would be found, in reality, they were left alone with each other and the dark, mysterious depths. The situation was extremely difficult, and the soldiers' misery was compounded by the fact that there were practically no provisions on board. We had about 2 buckets of potatoes, a loaf of bread, 1.5 kilograms of lard, 1.5 cans of stewed pork, about 1 kilogram of millet and peas, and about 50 matches. There was also virtually no drinking water. The only thing left was fresh water in the engine cooling system. But the barge crew remained undaunted, and although the circumstances were truly hopeless, the soldiers supported each other. Some might say that they hoped to be found soon, since they had no idea that the search had been stopped. But when the crew learned that the ocean area they believed the current and wind were carrying the barge was closed to shipping and air traffic from January 15th to February 15th due to intercontinental ballistic missile testing, They quickly realized they wouldn't be searched for until early March at best. But even despite this, Askhat Ziganshin, just in case, organized a 24-hour watch in the wheelhouse and decided to conserve food and water. After a full inventory of the food supply, it was discovered that the potatoes were completely soaked in diesel fuel, and the water in the cooling system was reddish with rust and had a metallic taste. That's when they realized the seriousness of their situation. To make their water supply last as long as possible, the boys figured out they needed to collect rainwater. They spread sheets on the deck and wrung them out when the rain got them wet. It's also worth remembering that it was incredibly cold in the iron barge, adrift in the open ocean. To keep warm, the soldiers initially used boards from crates, life preservers, rags, planks from 2 bunks, and other odds and ends as fuel for the stove. They used a kitchen knife to cut off chunks and toss them directly into the stove. This way, 1 tire would last a whole week. However, it was practically impossible to breathe. Despite the decision to conserve food, Ziganshin convinced his comrades that a sudden switch to a meager diet was unwise, as it could lead to immediate weakening. Initially, each person was given 3 potatoes, 2 spoons of cereal, and 2 spoons of stewed pork per day. But soon the rations were reduced to 1 potato and 1 spoon of cereal per person. On January 27th, the crew celebrated Kryuchkovsky's birthday with double the ration, 2 potatoes and 2 spoons of cereal per person. It was decided to give the birthday boy an extra portion of food as a gift, but they couldn't persuade him to accept it, so the water was divided among all 4. The current and wind carried the barge to the southeast, and after leaving the current, it was caught by the ocean current, which further accelerated its movement away from the shore. A few days after the barge began drifting, it encountered a second storm, and it so happened that for the first 2 weeks, the crew had to constantly pump out and bail out water from the hold, as the barge was constantly flooded. To keep the barge afloat, they also had to chip away at the freezing ice from the sides and deckhouse. Each new day passed in this way, in the unbearable cold. Only in the evening could they relax and rest a little. In their free time, the children read aloud from Jack London's book, which Ivan Fedotov had, and after that, Anatoly Poplavsky played the old accordion, and so passed the first 15 days of free navigation. When their minimal food supply ran out and only potatoes remained, the crew cooked soup for a while, but even that didn't last long. They soon realized with bitterness that there was nothing edible left on board. After starving for several days, the crews decided to subsist on tarpaulin boots, leather belts, toothpaste, and even soap. We cut up a leather belt into noodles and started making soup out of it. Then, we boiled a radio strap, boiled tarpaulin in ocean water to boil out the shoe polish, then cut it into pieces, threw it in the stove where it turned into something like charcoal, and then ate it. Before everyone else ate the leather from the tarpaulin boots, Ziganshin decided to try this food on himself. "I'll eat it first, and if I don't get sick in 24 hours, then you can have it too." That's how the team leader tested the new diet on himself. On the rare days when the ocean calmed down, the drifters tried to catch fish. They unraveled a nylon rope and wove its strands into fishing line. They fashioned a fishing hook from a nail and a lure from a tin can. But all these attempts proved unsuccessful. By that time, friends, they were already on their 40th day of wandering. Around the 41st day, the crew let out a lively shout, as loud as they could. It was then that the first ship was spotted, but attempts to attract its attention, as well as those of the 2 following vessels, proved fruitless. In the final days of their drift, the exhausted soldiers sewed together a kind of sack from blankets and slept in it together, keeping each other warm with their bodies. They began to be overcome by auditory hallucinations. Exhausted, they agreed that whoever felt completely exhausted would tell the others so they could say goodbye. And the last survivor would write their names somewhere prominent on the barge. On the 49th day of the drift, Askhat Ziganshin made his final entry in the journal and scribbled a note detailing the number of days spent in the ocean. On the wall, Back then, the crew couldn't even imagine that their starving journey would soon be over. What happened was pure luck, for there's no other way to describe it. On March 7, 1960, at around 3 a.m., the barge was spotted by a patrol aircraft from the USS Kearsarge, en route from Yokosuka to San Francisco. At the time of discovery, the barge was located in the valley about 28 kilometers from the carrier. Moreover, the location where the lonely barge was discovered was an incredible 1,700 kilometers from Iturup Island, where it departed from, and 1,300 kilometers from the nearest Marcus Island. Two planes flown by American pilots Glenn Conrad and David Miracle circled over the barge and flew away, and after a while, two helicopters appeared. Ziganshin was the first to be brought aboard the aircraft carrier. However, everyone understands that this was the Cold War, and even in such a situation, the crew hadn't initially planned to abandon the barge. Two planes flown by American pilots, Glenn Conrad and David Miracle, circled over the barge and flew away, and after a while, two helicopters appeared. A powerful hurricane, reaching speeds of up to 65 meters per second, tossed the barges around like toys. Unable to withstand the force of the storm, the cable connecting the barges to the barrel snapped. To avoid colliding, the crews were forced to uncouple the barges, and Askhat, as the senior in rank, intended to negotiate with the Americans and ask them for a supply of fuel, water, food, and a map, after which he would return home on his own. However, this was out of the question. The soldiers were in a state of extreme exhaustion and were on the brink of death. Having received assurances from the Americans that another vessel would pick up the barge, Askhat calmed down. On board the American aircraft carrier, the rescued men were offered broth, white bread, and coffee. The Americans were amazed that the soldiers in such a state retained their humanity and self-discipline. When offered food, they didn't pounce on it, but calmly passed the plate to their comrades. After eating, the rescued soldiers were taken to the showers. There, Askhat Ziganshin lost consciousness and awoke in a hospital bed. According to the aircraft carrier's chief surgeon, Frederick Beckwith, the soldiers had lost 20 to 25 kilograms. Yet, they tried their best to demonstrate soldierly endurance and character. But what surprised the American specialists most was that throughout the entire drift, the ambient temperature remained between 0 and 7 degrees Celsius. Yet, the soldiers did not die of hypothermia. The rescued soldiers were first transported to San Francisco. But as it turned out later, the barge crew was eager to return home. Sure, the soldiers rested a bit in America, gave a few interviews, and, with the help of the Soviet embassy, were transported through Europe to Moscow. It's also worth noting that the homeland greeted its heroes with enthusiasm. Each of the surviving soldiers received the Order of the Red Star, and they were also presented with a navigator's watch. It was a special honor for us that this watch was presented by Defense Minister Malinovsky himself. He told us not to wander off again,